everyone. Welcome to our discussion of how to cover the ongoing chaos in science funding in the U.S. right now, brought to you by the CASW Connector. My name is Amber Dance, and I'm the Program Director for CASW, the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing. I know I'm not the person you came here to see, but as we have the final latecomers trickling in, I'm just going to take a few moments as people are entering the Zoom to introduce the CASW Connector, because if you're not familiar with it, I think it's really cool. All right, you guys see my screen? Yes, okay. So Connector is basically like a one-stop shop for all kinds of resources related to science writing. It was created by Kate Travis and Betsy Ladijets, and it's now maintained by CASW's awesome librarian, Cindy McDonald. And you can see it just includes all sorts of different kinds of resources, videos, articles, databases, etc. So like say you just published a story you're really proud of and you wonder what kind of awards you might be able to apply for, you can just go here and find 37 different options. Or say you are interested in getting some sort of fellowship or grant, you can look here for grants, grants, and find 61 different options. And I wanted to quickly, for the topic today, highlight a special collection that Laura DeTaro put together for CASW Connector, which is reporting on federal changes to science funding. There are a lot of trackers out there, and this is sort of like a meta tracker of the trackers where you can find all different kinds of ways to look for resources. In particular, I know one that our speakers like is Grant Witness, and we're going to hear from one of the co-founders of that today. So one of our goals with today's discussion is to crowdsource a tip sheet and a resource list that we can all use going forward to cover this ongoing chaos in science funding. So I encourage you to not only drop your questions in the chat as we go along, but also any resources or tips that you have come across or used for covering government science funding, or maybe even share things that don't work that we shouldn't bother to try. And we're going to put this all together into a tip sheet that we'll share with attendees after the webinar. And if you know of any resources that belong in the connector and we don't have them yet, feel free to drop them in the chat, or Cindy will share her email and you can email them to us later. So we will go ahead and move on to the main event. Our panelists are going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion. So go ahead and add questions or comments or advice that you want to share anytime, and then I'll ask them when the time comes. We are videoing this, so it's going to be up on CASW's YouTube channel later. And I'll just remind everyone to make sure you're on mute if you're not speaking. So I'm excited to welcome today two stellar reporters. Katie Wu is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she covers science. Her work during the pandemic was essential reading, and she's received several major writing awards. And Stephanie Lee is a senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education, where she is spearheading their coverage of funding issues. She received CASW's Cone Prize for Medical Science Reporting in 2022 for investigations of scientific misconduct. So Stephanie, Katie, take it away.
Thanks, Amber. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Katie, how are you doing?
I'm good. And, you know, it's funny seeing all these names pop up on the screen because I recognize a lot of you and I'm like, wow, you're doing a really great job. I want to ask you questions.
I feel the same way. We'll hopefully get into it in the Q&A discussion part.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess just to kick things off, you know, funding chaos has been ongoing for the entirety of the year. And I'm just curious, what are the big stories or storylines that you're following right now as we head into the fall and winter?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think by definition it just has to be changing every single week, in part because the situation on the ground is changing every week, but also it's hard on readers and hard on writers to be covering the same type of story over and over and over from week to week. So I think a lot of what I'm thinking about right now is just how people are feeling after 9 months of this crazy whiplash, and if there are really key, you know, micro examples of like how badly certain types of research have been hit and, any way to sort of make concrete the consequences of this for the future. Um, but I think this is like a really active area of discussion. How do we cover this story that doesn't feel like it has sort of shifted in its stakes since January? How about you?
Yeah, it is definitely an onslaught of news. I would say right now there's a couple key storylines I'm following. One is as of this month, the new fiscal year has started for the NIH and the rest of the government. However, the government is shut down. So we don't know what the budget is going to be for the NIH this year, and obviously the size of it is going to affect everything else that gets decided about grant funding going forward. The NIH is also shifting to a model of multi-year funding where they're awarding the entirety of a grant upfront instead of parceling it out over 4 or 5 years. And so that could have really big implications for how competitive getting a grant is in any particular year. So I'm interested in following that. The federal government is also putting a lot of pressure on research universities. 60 universities in the country are under investigation for anti-Semitism allegations. The Trump administration, for example, is demanding $1 billion from UCLA over such allegations. And just putting a lot of pressure on, and part of this includes like freezing like federal funding to places that it deems out of compliance with the law. Just last week, 9 universities were offered a compact by the federal government where they need to comply with the administration's demands on things like capping international students, promoting viewpoint ideology among faculty in order to get a leg up in federal funding. And the insinuation is that if they don't comply, then they elect to forego all federal funding, which would obviously be a huge, huge deal. And so, the researchers on the ground I'm talking to are just having to make really hard choices about what the heck to do when this is changing all the time and they're just constantly new threats to their funding sources. How do they keep their projects running or make plans to hire graduate students and so on when they don't know if they're going to have money in a month or in 2 months. I recently wrote about a researcher at the University of Michigan who was part of a network of other researchers studying HIV, various aspects of HIV, and their funding got pulled because it was quote unquote a DEI set of studies. And hers was transgender youth and HIV. And the network as a whole was able to get their funding back online, but the caveat was that they were told that they would have to cut her study, particularly because it's about transgender youth. So that's just one example of the many really hard positions that researchers are being put in these days, kind of lose-lose almost. And it's forcing divides and camps that are normally united. And yeah, just making things really hard for everybody. So yeah, what about you, Katie?
Yeah, I mean, I think you were already kind of alluding to this in that very good answer. It is chaos all the time. There are 16 or 17 different science news items happening all at once. And sometimes, the administration will say, hey, we're doing this. And then the next day it's just kidding. And then the next day it's just kidding again. How are you managing all of this whiplash? How are you, writing stories that feel so fragile, like they could change even before you publish them?
Yeah, I try to not do daily development coverage of things. I mean, I'm fortunate that I'm in a position where I can decide to some extent what I can cover and not cover. And so I'm mostly choosing to not do incremental news just because things can become outdated within 2 hours. And I just try to use my best judgment for what is going to be a relevant feeling feature in a week, which I feel like is the most amount of lead time I get leeway I can have in writing something that takes a few days. And in terms of just figuring out what is going on, I use social media, which is harder now that Twitter is, collapsed effectively and the social media ecosystem is so fragmented. But Blue Sky has been a really good resource for me. A lot of academics are there. LinkedIn is also becoming very active in my experience. I also use Google Alerts for certain keywords that are of interest to me, and I get like a daily email with what happened in the news regarding that day. And then the rest of it is just very manual, which is just a lot of constant checking in with sources via Signal and text and email and phone calls about what's going on with them. How about you?
Yeah, well, can I ask one follow-up question? Can you think of an example where you passed over something that might have counted as an incremental, like a daily story, but you ended up folding it into something larger that was like a pattern you reported on? I'm putting you on the spot here, so if you want to take a second to think about it, I can also answer first.
Uh, yeah, I need to think about that.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah,
so
I
there's so
mean,
many like daily news stories. I'm like, no, I can't do that. I would say like also, my focus at the Chronicle of Higher Education is writing about academia and scholars. So I'm not trying to cover every memo being circulated inside the NIH. That's just like not my purview. And so I'm looking for things that are going to affect like the academy. And so that can like take some time to like trickle out. You know what I mean? So like I'm not covering so like when Trump did his executive order about like gold standard science or about changing government agencies so political appointees have more say over like science funding. I definitely noted those things when they came out, but I did not write about them and try to like write an analysis of them on the spot because I was like I'm gonna wait and see what this actually manifests in like a policy and a personnel sense, and then how that affects scientists' ability to get funding and do their work. So that's my answer.
Right. Yeah, no, and I agree with you. I think I have also been adopting that approach, like trying to decide what feels incremental, what actually feels like this is something worth taking a bigger swing. And even if something changes slightly, do I have enough to say that even if something is like slightly reversed, was there a bigger story at play here that I was feeding into that the sort of primary thesis will still hold? And so I remember, when like the big rounds of NIH grant terminations first started coming out, like the first couple waves felt so impactful, but then it was like another topic, another field of research. And I certainly didn't feel compelled to cover all of them. I waited, and I think the next big change in terms of NIH research priorities that I really decided to jump on was when I noticed that there was like this tiny trickle of things that wasn't just here's the science we don't want, but here's the science we do want. And so I tried to find a couple examples that really supported that thesis. Like, here's what the administration actually cares about. It's no longer process of elimination, but they are actually
Mm-hmm.
jumping after some things. And yeah, I agree. I think all the ways that you are sort of staying up to date on changes are super important. I've also never been like so active on text and Signal and DMs all over the place because, it's like the usual sources of information are no longer reliable. So I'm definitely relying on people sort of passing me information and then I'm confirming it with three other people. So there is constant communication all the time. There's like federal employees regularly texting me at 10 p.m. It just feels like this dystopian universe, but it has proven really useful.
Totally. And because the Atlantic's audience is so much bigger than the Chronicles, and again, I'm addressing like academics and scientists, and you're addressing, theoretically like the whole world. Like, how are you picking which lanes to follow in your coverage?
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky in that, even though we don't have like hyper specific beats on my desk, we are at least just science, health, and technology. And I think at the start of this mess, it was pretty clear that I was especially well equipped to write about a lot of things that I had sort of built up expertise and or a source base, especially through COVID reporting. So like infectious disease stuff, vaccines, assaults particularly on public health and like the sort of day-to-day actualizing public health and medical advice. The new thing that I sort of picked up in this cycle was covering a lot of stuff happening at NIH. And I am embarrassed to say I like just barely knew how NIH worked before this. I still only kind of know how NIH works at this point. It's very complicated, but I think it's just been I'm picking a few things to follow as often as I can, but I'm sort of drawing a line any given week. I can keep track of two things this week. Next week, I might swap one of those things out for something else, but I can only watch so many things at a time. Um, I admit this has come at the expense of like me paying attention to a lot of larger political news, and I feel very uninformed about a lot of what's happening in the world, but it is like just barely straining my attention and energy to track like the big theme of this conversation is it's too much. um how about you? What are some examples of things that you have decided are most worth your time?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, so yeah, I think focus is really key. Picking a lane and or two, three lanes and like trying to stay within them is so key to maintaining just sanity. I mean, we can't do it all. I mentioned a minute ago that my focus is on how scientists and academia are affected by policy changes, funding changes. So an example of that comes to mind is like this summer, there's a really big court case heard in Massachusetts over grant terminations, like 900 grants, at worth like $700 million. And all these unions, public health groups, and individual researchers sued over what they said were illegal grant terminations. And a judge in Massachusetts agreed with them and said they were illegal and that they'd have to be reinstated. So I was following this court case. Obviously, it was germane to like everything I've been following. I did not write about the opinion when it came out, but I was interested in like what is the process of grants actually getting restored? Like, what does that look like? Like, you get the money back in your bank account like the next day, uh, and then when you do get the money back, how do you plan, knowing that there is this very real precedent that the Supreme Court could like step in and say, actually, this is, illegal, you have to re-terminate, which it then did a few weeks later. How do you plan for like the next month or the next 3 months in terms of hiring, in terms of what experiments to start? And so I started just like calling all these researchers who were listed on the list of grants that had been slated for reinstatement and asking them like, have you heard from the NIH? Like, how are you going about this? And they were telling me about, like, I'm still not going to hire. I'm going to try to do preliminary data collection, but I'm like not counting on actually being able to finish my project and do the fullest best version of it that I can. So again, those like kind of real world, how does it affect researchers' ability to do their jobs is like the focus I try to apply to everything. I was curious about just into the sourcing. You talked about how you're constantly on texting and DMs and Signal, as am I. How are you keeping up with all of it?
Um, yeah, poorly is probably the answer. Uh, I wish I were responsible enough to be like charting everything in a nice little sidebar and being as thorough as possible every day. But I think I am largely relying on resources elsewhere to get a lot of that done. Um, I do think like yeah. Um, uh, I guess we'll actually have a better presentation on that in a minute. But I think before we do that, we have one more question between the two of us, right? And I think
Mhm.
this is about how how difficult it is to communicate with sources right now. I think we have this sort of dual issue right now where there's a lot of need to talk to a lot of scientists who don't have a lot of experience with the media, but can provide like really exceptionally good perspective on what's happening right now. Because suddenly everyone is in this collective chaos together, or people who would happily speak to you, except that they're terrified to do so. Um, and because they feel that speaking out would put more of their funding at stake or put them in the crosshairs of someone that they do not want to be hunted down by. How are you finding sources during this time, and do you have any strategies that you really relied on to get people to open up, and is there a good way to sort of handle anonymous sourcing during this time period?
Yeah, it's interesting where it's an interesting phenomenon where people who normally in the normal times are like very happy to talk to me about their work, like don't really want to. And then people who normally don't want to talk to me at all are happy to in like an off the record way. It's a strange dynamic. And uh, by which I mean like scientists at like universities are like afraid to talk often, but sometimes people inside the NIH are like very happy to talk because they're like so stressed out about what's going on there. So it's an interesting dynamic. Normally I try to just like start my, like an introduction to people off the record and have an off the record conversation with them about just like what their job is looking like these days, what their day to day is like, what concerns they have, what do they think a reporter should be looking into or drawing attention to. And so starting with like an off the record call and then like continuing the conversation over Signal. Signal is like the main app I recommend because it's like end to end encrypted. And I just kind of keep in touch with people constantly, like, and you know, stay in touch with them before I like need anything from them in terms of like a quote or anything. I look at it as really like maintaining this for the long run because it's like we're in a marathon, not a sprint. If people are afraid to talk to me, I will like send them stories I've done about, the funding stuff for the NIH, so they can get a sense of my work. I'll answer any questions they might have about talking to a reporter because a lot of people have like never talked to a reporter in this way before. When I'm doing a story, if there are anonymous sources, I just try to get as many anonymous sources as possible to corroborate something, like one anonymous source is two is good, three is better, four is great, and so on and so on. And then I also try to get documents whenever possible from people, in emails and so on that can't necessarily be traced back to any one person. And these are not, emails I'm necessarily like posting screenshots of on the website, but quoting from them, right, to try to again like disguise like the origin of the documents. And then finally, like when I talk to people, I say, can you refer me to other people who might be good to help me understand XYZ? And I just continue building out a network that way. How about you?
Yeah, no, that's a really good lead into my answer. Because I think I have definitely utilized the like degrees of separation networks very, very, very heavily. And I think I got especially lucky because I went to grad school for science and I happened to be acquainted with like one or two people, for who happened to like go on to NIH or even pass through there and have since left. So early on this year, I reached out to some of them and I was like, hey, do you know some people there? And like, can I maybe just start chatting with some people? And it's
Mm-hmm.
really, really, really grown from there. Like you, I always end pretty much every conversation, every positive interaction, if someone's not pissed at me for my reporting, I'm like, hey, can we
Right.
touch and can you refer me to someone else? And yeah, it has been really hard because I think a lot of these individuals are very like they want to speak out, but they're also they're at a low trust point in their life. I can't imagine why. But it's hard for them to
Totally.
like admit all of the things that they're admitting to a reporter and know that it's going to be, conveyed accurately. One thing that I think this is a very specific situation, but there was like a pair of pieces that I did back in gosh, February or March, what is time? It was one of my earlier NIH pieces, and I was working with one anonymous source who was really, really, really nervous about, being accidentally outed or, sharing too much information that it would be identifiable. And I was working
Mm-hmm.
on a larger story with this person. But we ended up having a really interesting part of the conversation that I thought was like, huh, this is kind of juicy enough that I could break it off into a smaller piece. And I sort of warned this person that I was going to do that. We ended up doing exactly that. I wrote a shorter piece first. It came out and, I sent it to the source and like, no one busted down this person's door and dragged him away. And I think, I'm being a little flip about it, but I think it really made this person much more comfortable. They opened
Oh,
up
that's so smart.
much more after that. We had like six more conversations. They ended up like being willing to share a document with me where they had compiled everything that had happened to them in the past 2 months. Like, and I think it was because I sort of did this gateway story that proved that I was trustworthy and that I could get the story right and not like blow up their spot in the process. Um,
That's so
what-
smart. I just want to say, like, I think beat reporting is like, I can't imagine doing any other kind of reporting style in this era. Like I don't know how I could spend like 4 months or, on like one like investigation or something, because things would just change so much during it. And I think putting out stories constantly shows people that like you said, can build trust along the way. Anyway, yeah.
Totally. The last thing I'll say is it's been really interesting to think about like the journalist relationship with the press officer at this time, because at universities especially, and I'm sure you would have thoughts on this as well, but just like I think prior to this year, I sort of I don't know, like sure, I maybe need to send you a request for comment, like as a formality towards the end of this piece. I'm not really expecting you to be like a vital resource in my reporting. I'm going to sort of find the right sources. I'm going to double check everything because, your part of your job is to promote University X, Y, and Z and make your faculty look good, so on and so forth.
Right.
I did sort of feel that, especially when I was like reporting a little bit on what was going on at Columbia. But I think in the months since, certain press officers at certain universities, I think, have sort of decided like, we're also fed up with all of this crap and, have been a little bit more willing to just like really, really, really be like incredible partners. And like, because many of them are like extraordinary journalists themselves, and they're such a valuable resource. I do still like try to do my due diligence and find some sources on my own, but especially when there's kind of like a lot of nervousness among a group of researchers, that can actually be like a connection that is worth working under certain circumstances.
That's a really good tip.
Um, All right. Should we maybe move to
What?
using Scott?
Yeah. Yeah. I'll introduce Scott. Scott Delaney is, along with Norm Ross, the co-founder of Grant Witness, a database that since March has been combining government information with crowdsourced data to track both NIH and NSF grant terminations. Scott is also a research scientist, most recently at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and was previously an attorney. Scott, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
We're so delighted to have you. Katie and I have both used Grant Witness so many times this year, and so we're happy to have you here. Maybe you can take us back in time a bit and tell us how this all came about. I think the first conversation I had with you back in the spring, Grant Witness was a Google spreadsheet that anyone in the world could come in and like enter their information, and feel like things have changed since then. So
Yeah.
walk us through it.
Yeah. No, I mean that is where it started. We have humble origins. So the Grant Witness, as it's now known, did start back in early March, and it started because at the time I had been reading press reports of the government claiming to terminate a couple $100 million in NIH grants. But the press reports didn't talk about whose grants. Or at least I was an NIH-funded researcher. Specifically, I'm a social and environmental epidemiologist. So the social epi work was kind of getting targeted, and I kind of figured it was probably some of my colleagues. I really wanted to know who can we support. And I also, had some doubts at the time that the administration's representations were in fact what was happening. So I looked as far as I could find for information on which grants were being terminated, found nothing, and thought, well, somebody out there knows the answer. Somebody had their grants terminated, so why don't we just ask? And I started a Google sheet that was, as you said, open for editing from anybody. And I basically just asked my community, both via social media and then also just via email, to add any grants that they knew that had been terminated. And that was on March 7th. And within a week, it started to grow pretty quickly. A key point happened sort of like the following week. Some colleagues of mine and my now co-founder partner in this, Noam Ross, introduced us. So while I was asking the sort of community of scientists that I knew for their information, he was busy independently looking for evidence in federal data sets to determine which grants had been terminated. So he was kind of on the back end.
Right.
I was kind of on the front end, and we met. decided to join forces, and the rest has been a little bit of a roller coaster. So just to fill that in a little bit, what we do now is as you said, so we aggregate data from every possible source that we can to identify and verify as much as we can which specific grants at NIH and now at NSF, and I can talk about EPA here in a minute, have been either terminated or frozen, and under what conditions. And then we link all of that information to other data just to kind of build out the picture so you can get a better sense of exactly which kind of grants have been targeted, who was doing the research and where, and basically just provide that fine-grained information about all of this chaos. So we do have our website. It's called Grant Witness now. It was called Grant Watch. We actually unfortunately stepped on somebody's toes. There is another Grant Watch. It's a full company. We are completely not associated with them.
Not affiliated. Yeah.
Not affiliated. Yeah. So we had to change our name, but what you see on our website, and I can show you here in a minute what that looks like, is only about half of what we do. Yeah, you want me? I can walk you through that right now.
Yes. Why don't you screen share and show people?
Yeah. So this is you should be seeing right now. This is Grant Witness. It's grant-witness.us. And I am aware that I'm talking to a bunch of professional communicators right now, so forgive the lack of refinement to our UI and UX on our website. This is a website built by data scientists, not by expert communicators. But with that said, you can see we sort of have a landing page here, and then up top we have different links. So we have NIH data, NSF data, and I'll talk about EPA data here in a minute. I don't want to spend too much time walking through the specific website because there's more to talk about, but I do want to highlight just a couple of things for folks that maybe have only seen this in passing or who haven't used it really much at all yet. So the first thing I want to point out is that we do have NIH data and NSF data. They're separate tabs. We use a tool called Airtable, which is just a platform you can use for anything to manage the back end. And Airtable has some built-in functionality that can help you interact with the data and explore it. So the first thing to point out is that over on the right-hand side here of the screen, where my cursor is, if you can see it, there's a button that says a list. There's another option for grid. And list and grid theoretically should display most of the same information, but grid actually probably has a little bit more information, which is not self-explanatory and not something you would necessarily know. So I recommend using grid, but list is sometimes more compact. You saw, or you may have noticed a minute ago, how slow the page loads, speaking of UI and UX. And list can sometimes load a little bit faster. So there's some reasons that we keep list up there. But leaving aside the grid button, the one that you really want to care about is this filter button, and that's how you're going to search. This little magnifying glass search function is just not good. But the filter button is great. So you can filter by all kinds of things. Right now, we have all grants displayed. But if you just wanted to identify the grants that are frozen, you would go status. That's, there's a whole bunch of fields here. These are the columns. Status contains, say, possibly reinstated. It's just going to show you, and the filter function's fast. It'll show you all the grants that have been possibly reinstated. I can talk more about that later. The last thing I wanted to show you is, so if you use our page and we have this big old banner on top, there's a button to download the CSV if you want to manipulate the data yourself, but it takes up a lot of screen space and it's a little bit slow and clunky. If you want to use our data in Airtable without it being embedded in our website, you got to scroll all the way to the bottom. And oh my Lord, are you serious? There we go. All the way to the bottom. And there's a little tiny button down here called View Larger Version. Just click on it. And it'll bring you all the same data in a native sort of Airtable space. I wouldn't take all this time to highlight this if I didn't think it was useful. This is how I search our data set. It is faster. It is easier. And one really nice feature is that for any columns that have numbers in them, it includes these nice summary sort of column totals. So you get really good estimates of the financial impacts of these terminations that are harder to get when you use the website. So I think those are kind of the main tricks that aren't obvious. The only thing I'd add is that we are starting to track EPA data. Unfortunately, at this time, the EPA tracker maybe isn't in a space that we feel super confident in. And there's a question about sort of data accuracy, which I can come back to, but we note that it's in beta. We'll build that out over the next couple of weeks, and we might expand to other agencies over time. But to the point about accuracy, a keynote, we do try to make the sources of our data transparent, so that you don't have to trust us for it. For every grant, you can expand on the left a card, and it will bring up all the information or most of the information that we have about it, at least public facing. And in here, we have some information about why we list it as we do. So for example, this one we think may have been reinstated because it was removed from the HHS tags list. This is also a grant at Columbia, which we know had most of its grants reinstated after Columbia capitulated its administration demands. So the goal of this is to be as transparent and reproducible as possible, because there's no other single source, including federal government sources, available that are comprehensive and accurate. We found inconsistencies across many different sources. So we really try to aggregate information and be as precise as possible, as much as possible, and then present that information to the viewer and the user so that they can have the same confidence that we do.
Amazing. I want to say I've seen a lot of praise in the chat for the UI, so I just want to convey that. We all love Grant Witness. We think it's great. This is an insane amount of work. So thank you for your service. I did not know that you were now tracking the EPA as well. So, I mean, that's a whole other can of worms. So amazing stuff. I'm curious, because we've got a bunch of journalists here, a lot of whose names you probably recognize. How are you finding your interactions with journalists during this year? And what are those interactions like?
Critical, indispensable. We put in a huge amount of work to provide granular data and make it, accessible. And we tell almost no stories. Our data doesn't have impacts unless somebody else comes along and tells a story. So I'm an epidemiologist. I count for a living. I was a lawyer before that. And so there's a lot of things I can do with the data and with translating that data for legal advocacy, which is another piece of the puzzle for us. And I have no capacity to tell stories the way that everybody on this call can. And we're very aware of that. Our value add is in the data. It's not in the storytelling. So without our interactions with journalists, our project just doesn't have much impact. And so we take every chance that we can to support journalist work, to support storytelling. Sometimes, we're a thin team, and until recently, we were all volunteer. So I wasn't always that quick to get back to folks, but we try to be extremely responsive, extremely sensitive to deadlines. And I found almost universally all of those interactions to be positive. I have found some conversations just sort of amusingly to be increasingly argumentative lately. I don't know why that's happening, but there are fraught topics. Look, speaking of transparency, the grants that supported my salary were terminated. I think what's happening is deeply troubling, both to science and to the rule of law in the United States, which has major implications for science and everything beyond it. We do use the data that we compile to organize scientists, to support advocacy, and to facilitate litigation. So very specifically, I've filed 5 different declarations and 3 different lawsuits that seek to have these grants reinstated, which is to say, my personal convictions are not neutral here. And some of the litigation and the topics that surround these grant terminations are fraught and maybe subject to different interpretations depending on one's perspective. And so when talking about the implications of this current, or these actions as they relate to science, I think different folks can have different opinions. So, but that's to overstate the challenge that I think I've had. I think in general, every interaction we've had has been not just positive, it's been critical to our project.
Well, we love to hear that. And again, we're so appreciative of all the work you're putting into it. Also appreciate the transparency about your personal perspective and position in all this. I think we'll wrap up that part of the session now and perhaps head to the Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Scott. That was really interesting. So we're going to head into the Q&A/discussion. You can ask a question, but also anybody out there, if you have something you want to share, I can see everybody, I think, on my screen. So if you want to just raise your hand or post in a chat, we can try and call on you. Also, I thought what Katie said about working with PIOs differently right now is really interesting. And I know we've got some fantastic PIOs on this call. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but if you have anything you'd like to share about how reporters can best work with you and your scientists, feel free to raise your hand. I want to ask, a couple of people had asked before this discussion, how do you get accurate numbers about the funding that has been frozen, especially when things are changing on a daily basis? And because I'm going to guess that that's not possible, what is your best method for getting a good enough estimate, and how would you phrase that in a story to indicate how confident you are of that number on a given day?
I think Scott can speak to the
Sure. I mean, I can answer that for grant witness. I mean, with due regard to like a number of different really outstanding trackers that provide a number of different tools, at least within the context of ours, I'd say a couple things. So first, federal data sets, many of which we use because we compile data from multiple data sources, update usually about Sunday night. So by Monday, we're rerunning our pipeline. So by Thursday, you should probably check with us to make sure that nothing has changed since Monday. But we do update data weekly. And if something major were to happen, we would update it daily. One of the challenges that we've had is that something will happen, like Harvard wins its lawsuit at the district court. And theoretically, Judge Burroughs says all the grants have to come back. Well, they don't come back right away. There's the next question of where the government comply. And then after the government complies, how long does it take for the money to start flowing? And so if we list the grant as possibly reinstated, and we use that word possibly, that word possibly is doing a lot of work for us. The day that the judge orders them to be reinstated, we're maybe jumping the gun, maybe not. At the same time, it will take several weeks, sometimes up to a month and a half, for grants that were previously frozen to appear as unfrozen in federal data sets. So we have this problem where things happen in the news. Columbia settles, Brown settles, UCLA is doing whatever UCLA is doing, right? They're kind of fighting, but there's like this lawsuit against Thacker's going back and forth. And that has implications of the grants, but the federal data doesn't support that. So we're always struggling about when to update our estimates, like always. So we litigate this every single week. I think two things. I think we try to be up to date. At the same time, I don't know why I just got a thumbs up there. I think we try to we try to not get ahead of our skis. Like we try to have empirical data to support what we think is happening, which induces a lag. And I think the third thing is if there's ever questions, if you're ever doing reporting and you have a question like, is this the right number? 100%, you should email us or reach out to me on Signal. I put both addresses in the chat. And just ask, because I can tell you all the things that we're working through on a daily basis to try to update and all the reasons that your estimate might be too high or too low. Sometimes it just takes a long time. At Duke, they had 51 grants that had been frozen, And we didn't know which 51 they were until this week. They were frozen back at the end of July. It took that long. So they just didn't appear in our data set. So what I had to tell people was, well, our estimate is low. We know it's conservative. We just don't know exactly by how much. But this is all we can prove. So check back with us. It's those kinds of things. We try to be transparent, including in the things that we don't know. And I found that that's the case with everybody else that we've worked with too on their trackers. So there's a trials tracker that tracks, possibly affected clinical trials, and SciMap is on here. I just saw Mallory in the chat. It's an incredible tool. And so I think we're just trying to be transparent and do our best. But there's no, this is an obvious point to everybody on the call, but there's no substitute for just kind of, I want to say get on the phone, but get on Zoom, get on Signal, whatever, just asking, because we can always try to fill in any questions.
Thank you. I'm seeing a couple questions that kind of relate to if funding is reinstated, like how does that work? Do we even know? I think maybe Stephanie, you looked into this a bit. How does the money start flowing? Can you talk just a little bit about, is there any common pattern in that, or is it still just who knows?
I think, again, Scott could answer this better than I could, but in my experience in talking to people, typically like weeks go by before they get notice of awards. People, but that sometimes it's quicker than that, sometimes longer. Sometimes the reinstatements are coming back with like new terms and conditions that weren't in the original like contract, so then that has to be negotiated further between the institution and the government. And it also depends on like at what point in the grant's life cycle the grant was cut off. So like sometimes it includes back pay, and other times it's like not clear. So it's very case by case, which is very annoying. Scott, any insight on that?
No, the case by case is that's the top line. That's the beginning and the end of the answer. The middle of it is that in every case, NIH and NSF has tried to comply with court orders, which wasn't guaranteed. Certainly, there's other court orders in other domains where the federal government hasn't complied maybe as quickly. When it comes to grant terminations and grant freezes, they absolutely had. And so things can take some time. But and there are instances where grants fell through the cracks or weren't reinstated in time. Plus the law is changing, which is just like another facet to this that drives you crazy. But yeah, a couple of weeks, most of it comes back, but it is case by case.
Amanda had submitted a question before the meeting that I thought was interesting, that, like you said, Katie, this government funding world is foreign to anyone who hasn't been steeped in it, and they have their special lingo. They have RFAs and UO1s and RO1s and recompetes and all this stuff. Have any of you found a good way to kind of get up to snuff fast on just the language and how all of this works?
Katie, maybe?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? For whatever reason, I lost connection for 30 seconds just now.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So, I mean, as you mentioned, like the NIH and all these other government organizations, they have this very complicated system, and it's got its own jargon with RFAs and recompetes and UO1s and RO1s and blah, 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 blah. And I was curious if any of you have any tips on how to get up to snuff quickly on how to just even speak that language and understand what's going on.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I am still learning this day by day as it comes. I generally have had to like let go of a lot of pride and just be like, you've just used, when I talk to someone, like you've just used 19 acronyms. I don't understand. Can you literally walk me through each of them extremely carefully? And I've also made a habit of like, especially when I'm relying on, the accounts of like 3 people instead of official information that's posted somewhere, like I'm verifying with each of them after I do my reporting and saying, hey, I'm going to paraphrase something back to you. Is my understanding pretty correct? And once I start to hear the same thing from multiple people, I feel a lot better. I think also the nice thing is like, usually there will be things at the federal level there's like 8 different terms for slightly different use cases for funding and like the way that grants are vetted and like all the procedural stuff. You can still collapse it and simplify it quite a bit in a way that's not inaccurate and like call different things like a pledge to fund a researcher. And it's still simpler for the reader, I think, as long as you get the gist. I've tried not to get overly bogged down in the details because I find that when I incompletely understand something, I actually get worse at explaining it. And so when I find myself doing that, I'll go back and make sure that like my simplest understanding is correct. And then usually that's a good sign.
Yeah, I mean, that's just like covering any complicated science, right? Same technique.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. What effect are you guys seeing of the shutdown? Is that making your tracking harder, your coverage different, or have you not seen the effects yet?
I feel
mean, I
like
can
there's
tell you,
a holding pattern on the coverage side of things because researchers are like, what's going to happen? And nobody knows. But yeah, Scott.
no, I was just gonna say, I mean, on the grant termination side, well, there's nobody to terminate grants, which is lovely. Um, by the way, like, NSF had been terminating grants right up through the end of September. There were 5 new grants that were terminated for the first time in months in the last 2 weeks of September. So, um, but I think, separate and apart from that, I'm sure there's a lot of folks on this call who have had similar conversations. The folks who work at NIH and at NSF and at EPA, NASA, DOE, and many others are, deeply concerned about the impact of the shutdown on their capacity to administer, manage, and make grants going forward. So while they're in a holding, kind of holding, I don't know what the word is, holding pattern, we've actually found a grant with this, an opportunity to kind of reset our communications and learn more about sort of what we missed and what we need to be looking at going forward.
Stephanie, did you want to add anything on that? Okay. So Rita Oxenfeld had submitted an interesting question that's sort of tangentially related to this, is that how can we cover ongoing issues within science, like, for example, cases of misconduct that I know Stephanie has worked on, without fueling people who might then call to reduce or cut funds? How do you think about that in this environment?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who has covered a fair amount of research misconduct stories in the past, I don't think that worrying about the outcome should be the determining factor in whether you write a story. I just think there's too many variables that go into the outcome of like a story in the real world, and that shouldn't be our primary concern. I think we should decide whether to write stories based on, is it in our beat? Is it an important story? Importance can be defined in many different ways. Is there a lot of money at stake? Like, is the science in question very influential, and so on. And I just think there's a lot of like, also like, do I have time to write this compared to everything else I'm doing? So I think it's a discussion to have with your editor, with yourself. And so there's always many variables that we as journalists consider when deciding whether to cover something or not. But I don't think we should let is this going to lead to a bad outcome for the scientific enterprise be like the main driver, because that's like not, that just shouldn't be the animating question.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I think this fundamentally gets at like the independent role of the journalist, right? We're chronicling. Stephanie's like literally chronicling higher education. We're chronicling, we're like advocating. And I think like in some ways, I would even sort of push back on the possible premise of the question, right? I don't think the way that science gets funded is by making it seem perfect or flawless or free of misconduct, right? Like that misconduct needs to be acknowledged. And like part of our goal as journalists is to hold the people that we write about accountable. If the public sees that happening, that is in some ways like an endorsement of like, can we trust, the funders to get it right? Can we trust the people vetting other science to get it right? Like these are the sorts of questions that I want readers to be asking, not like, are journalists doing a good enough job propping up the scientific enterprise, Yeah.
Yeah, I would apply the questions like for politics. Like, would you ever say like, oh, we shouldn't cover problems in Congress because then people might not trust the government? Like, no, that doesn't like register, right? So we should apply the same principle to science coverage, I think.
Just
Yeah,
real
that's
quick,
always a good trick.
I hesitate to say this as a non-journalist, but I think one thing that I've noticed in having many conversations with journalists over the last several months is that we are at a moment where there are challenges that the scientific establishment faces. For example, the indirect cost recovery rates and the way that we calculate them at universities is Byzantine and difficult to understand, and maybe not the best policy. Maybe it is, I don't know. But we also have actors in our federal government who are using these challenges that the establishment faces in bad faith to achieve other policy ends. And so when you tell a story about the Byzantine nature of indirect cost recovery rates at face value, that can then be used really easily to malicious ends. And trying to tell stories in, transparent, concrete ways, within that environment, I can only imagine can be extremely challenging. I probably everybody on here has had something like that happen before, but it's, I think, new to us in the scientific establishment, or at least it feels new. I think there's that piece to keep an eye on too, or at least that's something that we think about when we try to communicate.
So Laura, you had wanted to ask a question about how we can reach audiences who don't usually pay attention to science news. I don't know if you want to come off mute and ask it yourself.
Oh, sure. Hi, thanks. This has been amazing. Well, I was reading an essay in Stat about a scientist, an epidemiologist, I believe, who was overhearing a COVID doubter conversation in a bar and decided to insert herself, which is really interesting. But she had a part where she described that they had no idea about anything that was going on at the CDC and how kind of that disconnect between the people who are frantically in this all day, every day, and it's total chaos, and that the majority of people don't even know any of it is happening. So I'm curious how you think about writing about these intricacies of funding and grants and NIH stuff for people who maybe don't even know what the NIH is, or don't think about science ever, but maybe would care if they knew and are entitled to know as people who are, citizens and residents of the US.
Yeah, I feel like I have yet to attend a talk or panel on science journalism where a version of this question does not.
Yeah, not a very original.
Which is not to criticize you for asking, but it's one of the most pressing and persistent issues in our field, right? Like, people tune into what they want to tune into, they hear what they want to hear, and frankly, even if they were exposed to everything that everyone in this chat are writing all the time, would they necessarily believe it? It's a great question, and I do often think about it. I don't have a perfect answer, but I think the best things that I try to do is, whenever I can, I try to write about really diverse sets of topics, really diverse sets of people, in the hopes that if someone does read something I write, they will see themselves or something that they hold dear to them reflected in some part of the piece, and it will resonate with them. The other thing that I do is I try to, I don't know, talk about my reporting outside of my main employer, which is the Atlantic. If a local radio station contacts me and says, hey, we want to interview you about your reporting, or there's a podcast, even if it's not one that I frequently listen to, or it's not a top 10 show, I try to say yes whenever I can, because I never know who it's going to reach. The local news spots especially feel so important to me, because for so many people across the country, that is their main news source, not the Times, not Fox News, not even Newsmax or whatever, those big ticket things. Sure, they also have their political divides, but people are tuning in to what the people closest to them are saying. And I think that is such a forgotten part of this, that I just want to emphasize how important it is to go local, even if it's not necessarily your local. My local thinks a lot like I do. It just happens to be the part of the world I live in. And even though I sometimes feel out of place, talking to people in Wisconsin or whatever, I try to do it all the same, and it gives me more practice doing my job.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so I know we could keep on discussing this topic for a long time, but we all have stories to write about science and funding and the intersection thereof. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Remind you, if you think of any other tips, you can share it with us by email to Cindy or the rest of us at CASW. We will send out the tip sheet in the coming days, and we'll be posting the video on CASW's YouTube channel. So thanks so much to all of our speakers for sharing their great thoughts and tips, and thanks everyone for coming and sharing your own. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.